Alright guys, so today I'm going to explain what fluency actually means. People like to throw the term being fluent in a foreign language. What does that, really mean? So, at least with my definition, I think fluent means when you're able to understand spoken language specifically. When you're able to understand spoken language 99%. And so this is the input, right? For the output means you're able to comfortably express whatever you want. So fluency in my definition means that you're able to understand what people say to you 99% of the time, which means that you understand 99% of what they're saying, almost 100%, like if you're to go to the country, and you're able to comfortably speak. I think this will be an example of someone who's fluent in a language. Not native level, but fluent. Because the thing is, guys, is when it comes to languages, there's a lot of domains in language that are hard to master, right? Even in your own even in your native language, sometimes you will not know every single word, because there might be very specific scientific words. In math, science, physics, there's even in nutrition. Like when I talk about insulin, when I talk about cortisol, like people don't know these terms, or like fructose or sucrose or glycogen, glucose. Like these are very specific words in English that I know because I've mastered the domain of nutrition in English. But those words, you don't need to know those words to be necessarily fluent, because fluent just means you understand 90% of the common language, of the commonly used language, right? So this means that you can go to the country, and if you speak to people, you can pretty much understand 99% of what they're saying. Because the reality is 90% of the language is the same within all domains of language. It doesn't matter if you're reading a book, if you're watching the news, if you're reading a fantasy book, if you're reading something that's very scientific, if you're reading a doctorate dissertation, 90% of the language is the same. Now there's an extra 10% that's different with domains. So maybe in a fictional sci-fi fantasy novel, there'll be very sci-fi fantasy words, right, that are going to be used. Or like, you go to the news, and there's going to be very like news type vocabulary that's going to be used. That extra 10% of flair. Same with anime. Like, there's very anime specific vocabulary, but there's an extra 10% of anime in there. 90% of the language is still the same in Japanese across all of Japanese media. It's just the extra 10% that's like kind of anime. So when it comes to becoming fluent, it's about understanding that 90% of common language that's used in all domains. So if you guys are able to basically understand everyday Japanese or everyday of the spoken language and understand what people say to you, and you're able to fluently speak them, like if you're able to fluently talk to them back, I will consider that fluent. Because the reality is, like, learning a language is a never-ending cycle. It's a never-ending thing. Like, you constantly can improve the language over, constantly. It's like a spectrum. It's not like there's like a certain point where it's like, okay, I've mastered this language. You can always improve your own languages, right? So it's like a spectrum, right? It's like a spectrum of like very, like, nothing of the language to like you're like a god mastering the language, like you're like a professor, right? I would say fluency would be like around here, and this extra gap here will be just filled up with like a lot of more reading, learning more scientific words, learning more words that are very domain specific. So in literary words, right? These are basically words that you don't necessarily need to use for talking, but frequently come up in novels, right? For example, like there's a lot of words in here, that are frequently used, for literary words, like, but they will never be spoken. Like, it'll be weird for me to use some of the words in here because it's too sophisticated. Like, I can speak like they do. I can speak like, I can use some of the words in here, like very hard words, literary words, and I can kind of use it. But I only use it in a very specific context of me giving like a lecture to a class. Because it'll be weird for me to talk like that in that very sophisticated manner, like to like a friend or like daily conversation. Because it'll be like I'll sound too smart. You know what I mean? Like, you don't want to sound too smart, when it comes to these languages. Because like if you know too much vocabulary, like that was my problem with Japanese, was that my Japanese was too smart. Like I was speaking like Shakespeare. Like I was speaking Shakespeare Japanese. So I had to dumb down my Japanese from Shakespeare to normal, right? Like, so that was the problem with my Japanese, at least, because I was reading too many books. So that's my definition of fluency, guys, is basically if you guys are able to understand 99% of spoken speech, specifically spoken speech, not necessarily written. Because here's the thing, like even with French, so I would consider myself fluent in French, because when I was in France a month ago, I was pretty much understanding 99 what they were saying, 99%. I was able to speak whatever I want, even if I made like a couple grammar errors here and there. I was pretty much fluent, So I wasn't native level, but like I was like fluent. You know what I mean? So, and even when I listen to some podcasts in French, I understand like maybe 95%. So like that would be like basically there'll be some words here and there that are more rare and that are more like I said, domain specific, more sophisticated, that I wouldn't know in French, for example. Like that would be, like if I were to listen to a doctor explain like the science of nutrition in French, right? Like there'll be like some words I wouldn't know, because remember those words are very domain specific. They're words that are specific to a domain, so I won't know those words. But I don't necessarily need to know those words to be fluent, right? Because as long as I understand what people are saying to me in France on the streets, and I'm able to talk to them and get to know who they are, like I'll consider that fluent. So it's about like understanding your natural input at like because it's weird, because like listening to podcasts in French is actually a little bit harder to understand than normal conversational speech when I'm actually talking to people in France. So when I was in France actually talking to people, it was a lot easier. Like the type of language I was spoken there was like a lot easier, because I was like kind of like meeting people and whatever, right? I feel like the language they're using in the podcasts that I was listening to, because I listen to podcasts like Popcorn, Popcorn is like hosted by Domingo, right? I watch that podcast, and sometimes there's like intellectual speakers that come on that talk about a certain subject, and some of them might use a little bit like there'll be some words here and there that I wouldn't know, right? But am I not fluent just because I don't understand those like specific words? Like no, not really, because it's like, well, I can still understand what they're saying. Like I can understand the gist of what they're saying, even if I don't understand those specific words. So at least with French, like yeah, that's that. So even if you are listening, but you should be able to understand a lot of the language. Like just because like you don't understand those domain words, like fluent is fluent. This means like you can understand what people are saying to you. Like no problem. Like this means that you can really understand like like everyday conversational speech. Like you should have mastered that. That's like mastery over that, where you can talk to anyone. That's what I would consider as actual like fluent. So yeah, guys, that would be my definition of fluency, because like the spectrum is off, because people like to kind of go here and up and down, but that's like what my definition of fluency would be. Of course, once you're fluent, you can always go to specific domains of language, right? You can learn more anime literary words, right? Learn more fantasy words that they use in anime. Like those words, you don't need to learn those words for daily conversation in Japan, but you need to know those words if you want to learn how to watch, fantasy anime. If you want to be able to watch fantasy anime without any cracks in your knowledge, you won't be able to actually understand fantasy anime 100%. You're going to have to learn those fantasy words. But like I said, those fantasy words are not needed for a conversation with a Japanese person in Japan. You can understand? So like, but you would need those words if you're trying to watch fantasy anime. I'm just telling you guys, like when it comes to fantasy anime, and at least with like Japanese, yeah, it's a whole plethora of vocabulary you're going to have to learn. Like a whole plethora. Like mastering the fantasy anime domain is hard, okay? Like you're going to really have to learn a crap ton of words. There's a crap ton of words you're gonna have to learn. Madoshi, I don't know. Like there's so many words that pop up like in those animes that are not commonly used. Like megami. I forgot. No, what's the one for megami? Megami would be like what is a megami? Goddess? I think that would mean goddess. And just like there's just certain words that like you would never use in everyday conversation, but they're always used in like fantasy anime. Like or like tobatsu, tobatsu or ense, right? Like a voyage, exploration, or like gassen. Like gassen is one like that would be commonly used. Like it's like a return after a battle. There's like what are other ones? There's like a lot of very specific Japanese words that are only used in anime fantasy, right? And I'm talking about fantasy anime. They're not used even in like Classroom and Elite, because Classroom and Elite is like high school drama anime. Like it wouldn't be used here, but it'll be used in like a anime like ReZero, Mushoku Tensei, Konosuba, like those in those fantasy animes, like that's where those words will be used, right? So, um, like yeah, so you're gonna have to really learn those words to understand those types of animes. But like I said, you don't need to know those words to speak to a Japanese person. You don't need to know the word for gassen, tobatsu, madoshi, majutsushi. Like you don't need to know all that crap, to speak to someone. So that's why, like, I don't. That's why I categorize fluency specifically as you've mastered at least the daily conversation side of things, where you're able to understand, or 99% of people speak to you. So that's why I categorize that as fluent. Because if you want to master that, you can, but at least it's not a requirement for speaking. So yeah, guys.